The Elephant Man, Chapter 1. My name is Dr. Frederick Trevis. I'm a doctor at London Hospital. One day in 1884, I saw a painting in the window of a shop near the hospital. I stood in front of the shop and looked at that painting. First I was intrigued, then angry, then scared. It was a scary, ugly picture. There was a man in the picture, but this man did not look normal. He looked like an elephant. I read the text below the picture. Go inside and see the Elephant Man, 2 pence. I opened the door and went inside. There was a man in the shop with a cigarette in his mouth. He was wearing an old, dirty coat. He turned to me and asked, "What do you want?" "I want to see the Elephant Man," I said. "No, the shop is closing. You must come tomorrow," the man said. "I'm sorry, but I want to see him now," I said. "I don't have time tomorrow, and I have a lot of work to do. I can give you more than 2 pence for that." The man looked at me carefully. Then he took the cigarette out of his mouth and smiled with his yellow teeth. "Agreed," he said. "Then give me 12 pence." I said, "Okay," and gave him the money. We walked to the back of the shop together. We entered a small room. The room was cold and dark. There was a bad smell inside. There was a table in the middle of the room. A creature was sitting in the chair behind the table. I say creature because it looked very strange. He had a cloth wrapped around his head. We moved towards him. The shopkeeper said loudly, "Get up! Take off the cloth!" The creature slowly stood up. He took the old cloth off his head and laid it on the chair. I was very surprised. I hadn't seen anything like this before. I'm a doctor, so I know a lot about accidents and sick people. I see terrible and sad things every day. But this creature, this thing, was the worst. There was no patient like him in the hospital. He was just wearing old trousers. He didn't have a shirt, coat, or shoes. Because of this, I could see his body very well. His head was the most interesting part. It was very, very large and looked like a giant bag with a lot of books in it. He didn't have much hair. On the back of his head was a brown, dirty bag of skin. This skin went down below his neck. I couldn't see one of his eyes clearly because there were too many pieces of skin on the front of his face. A huge tooth came out of his mouth. It looked like an elephant's tooth. His mouth and nose were like holes in his face. His skin was not supple. Therefore, it was difficult to understand his mimics. Is he laughing? Is he crying? Is he angry? it wasn't clear. The creature also had other skin bags on the front and back of its body. These bags went down to his legs. The right arm was very strange and had skin bags on it. His right hand was like a man's foot and was huge. But the left hand and left arm were quite beautiful. The left arm had wonderful skin. The fingers of the left hand were long and beautiful. It was almost like a young woman's hand. "Go, Merrick! Come on! Move quickly!" said the shopkeeper angrily. Then he pushed him. The creature slowly crossed the room. The poor man could not walk well. His legs were huge and fat. He couldn't go far without a cane. I felt sorry for him. "Let him sit," I said. "This is enough." "Okay," said the man. "Sit down, Merrick." We left the room and closed the door. The shopkeeper smiled at me with his yellow teeth. "It's great, isn't it?" he said. "The best elephant man in England. Hundreds of people come to see him, you know. Hundreds. I take him all over the country." "Yes, very interesting," I said. "Can I sit here for a while?" "Sure. You can sit in that chair over there," said the man. He looked at me, smiling. "Would you like a glass of water?" "Yes, please," I said. Then I started to explore the shop. Everything was pretty old and dirty. Some of the windows were broken. Some had no curtains. There was a worn and discolored carpet on the floor. It was very gloomy inside. I took a sip of my water. "Did you call that creature Merrick?" I asked. "Yes," said the man. "His name is Joseph Merrick, the best elephant man in England. I take him all over the country. People want to see him." "Yes, I understand. Do you make a lot of money?" "Well, sometimes, but the police make our job harder. They don't like us very much. Small children and some people are afraid of him. That's why we can't stay in a town for very long. We usually move every week." "It must be difficult for both of you." "Yes, it is difficult, but we have to." "By the way, what's your name?" "Silcock, sir. Simon Silcock." "I am Dr. Frederick Trevis. I am a doctor at the London hospital." "I am pleased, Mr. Trevis." "I am thinking, this man, Joseph Merrick, is a very interesting case. I would like to take him to the hospital and examine him in detail." "What do you say?" "I do not know. How come?" "Or is it the money? Do you want more?" "Well, yeah. It wouldn't be bad at all." "Understood. Don't worry about money." "And you should send him a coach. Merrick can't just go out, you know." "I'll pick him up by a coach tomorrow morning." The Elephant Man, Chapter 2. The next day, I came to the shop by a coach at 7 o'clock. Since it was early in the morning, there were not many people on the road. We were in November, so it was still dark. I knocked on the door of the shop. I waited a little. Then the door opened, and the creature Merrick came out. On his head was a black hat, like a big box. A gray cloth was falling from the hat in front of his face. There were holes in the cloth in front of his eyes. He could see outside through the holes, but I couldn't see inside. He was wearing a long black coat. His coat started at his neck and ended at his feet, so I couldn't see his arms, body, or legs. On his feet were large shoes, and they looked like old bags. He was holding a stick in his left hand and was walking very slowly. I opened the door of the carriage and got out. "Good morning, Mr. Merrick," I said. "Can you come in?"
"Help me up steps,"
he said. "I'm sorry," I said. "I do not understand." For a moment he stood by the carriage door and said nothing. Then he hit the carriage with his stick.
"Steps,"
he said loudly.
"Help me up the steps."
Then I understood. There were 3 steps to the car. "Yeah, I get it. Sorry," I said. "Let me help you." I took his left hand and started to help him. My right hand was on his back. I felt very strange. His left hand was like that of a young woman, but his back under his coat was terrifying. I could feel the skin bags on his back through his coat. He put one of his huge feet on the first step and then stopped and waited. He moved his second foot slowly. Then he stopped and waited again. "Hello, sir. May I help you?" I looked behind me. He was the postman, and behind him I could see 3 young boys. One of the children laughed. The postman asked, "Is the gentleman sick?" I thought quickly. "Yeah, but that's a lady, not a gentleman. I'm a doctor. Hold her hand so I can help her better." The postman took Merrick's left hand, and I helped him with both hands from behind. Slowly, very slowly, Merrick climbed the steps and got into the carriage. One of the children was very close to the carriage. He called out to his friends, "Run, guys! Here's a fat woman in a black coat! You should see the huge hat on her head!" The children eagerly approached the car. They were pushing each other to see inside. Just then, I closed the door and prevented them. "Thank you," I said to the postman. "You're welcome, sir," he said. "A strange lady, isn't she?" "Sick, that's all," I said quickly. "We are going to the hospital. Goodbye, and thank you." The coach started to move. I looked at Merrick. "That was hard, wasn't it?" I said. He didn't say anything at first, but then he spoke. It was difficult to understand him. However, I did not give up. I listened to him more carefully. That's how I could understand his words. "The steps were very difficult," he said. "But most things are very difficult for me." "Yes," I said. "Nothing is easy for you, is it?" "No," he said. He was quiet for a while. Then he asked, "Who are you, sir?" "Who am I? I'm sorry. My name is Dr. Trevis. This is my card." I gave him a card with my name on it. Did he know how to read and write? Merrick took the card and held it for a while. Then he put it in his pants pocket. We arrived at the hospital in no time. I helped him get out of the coach and walk to my room. I started to examine him. I examined his head, arms, legs, and body. Then I wrote down important things about him in a small notebook. A nurse helped me during the examination. She was a little nervous. I think she was also very surprised and frightened by this view. Merrick was nervous too. He hardly spoke during the examination. He just answered the questions I asked from time to time. We finished our work at the hospital around 4 o'clock in the evening. I put him back in the carriage and took him back to the shop. The shopkeeper let him in. Before closing the door, he asked, "Dr. Travis, have you found anything other than that he's a freak?" I didn't say anything. I didn't like that guy very much from the very beginning. He was cruel. Poor Merrick was with this man for years. The next day, I left the hospital early in the afternoon. The weather was rainy and cold. Most people wouldn't want to be outside in such weather. But I really wanted to see Merrick. I rang the bell of the shop, but no one opened the door. I pressed the bell again and again. There was no one. Then I looked at the shop window. Merrick's photo wasn't there. I understood that they were gone. The Elephant Man, Chapter 3. I didn't see Merrick for 2 years. Then one day, a police officer brought him to the London hospital. He had my card in his hand. He looked very tired. He smelled like he hadn't taken a bath in months. But it was great to see him again. "Are you hungry?" I asked. He nodded his head. "Yes." I had a few leftover biscuits for breakfast. I gave it to him immediately, and he began to eat hungrily. Then he told us about his adventures. After the police left, I started to think. What would happen to Merrick? Where would he stay? Who would look after him? I couldn't put him in the hospital because he wasn't sick. He just needed care. Nobody wanted him because of his physical appearance. I thought maybe the director of the hospital could help us. I decided to tell him about Merrick. Hospital Director Carr Gum listened to me attentively. The number of beds in the hospital was small. It was very difficult to find a spare room. In short, the hospital's facilities were not enough to take care of him. But Mr. Gome had a great idea. We were going to raise money to help Merrick. To this end, he wrote a letter to the editor of the Times newspaper. The letter was as follows. "Dear Sir, I am writing to you about a man in our hospital. He needs your help. His name is Joseph Merrick, and he is 27 years old. He is not sick, but he cannot leave the hospital because he is very, very ugly. Nobody likes to look at him, and some people are afraid of him. We call him the Elephant Man. 2 years ago, Merrick lived in a shop near London Hospital. His photo hung in the shop window. People paid 2 pence to see him. Most people were afraid of him. Many made fun of him. One day, working in our hospital, Dr. Frederick Trevis saw Merrick. He brought him to this hospital and examined him. He wanted to help him and gave him his card. Dr. Trevis went to the shop the next day, but could not find anyone there. Unfortunately, the shop owner, Silcock, took Merrick to Belgium. Many people there wanted to see him. Merrick earned £50. However, Silcock did not give him the money. He left him in Belgium. Merrick returned to London alone. The people on the train and on the ship treated him badly. The London police even put him in jail. But then they saw Dr. Trevis's card and brought Merrick to the London hospital. Here, sir, is Merrick's story. This man has no money and cannot work. His face and body are very, very ugly. Therefore, many people are afraid of him. However, he is a very interesting man. He can read and write and thinks a lot. He's good and quiet. Sometimes he makes crafts and gives them to the nurses for being nice to him. He remembers his mother, and he has a picture of her. She was nice and kind, he says about his mother, but now he doesn't see her at all. Can the Times readers help us? This man is not sick, but he needs a home. We can give him a room in the hospital, but we need some money. Please write to me at London Hospital. Yours faithfully, F.C. Carr Gome, Chairman of the London Hospital. The Elephant Man, Chapter 4. The editor of the Times read the letter and made a story about Merrick. Within a week, they collected £50,000 for him. This way, Merrick could live in the hospital his whole life. We gave Merrick 2 rooms at the back of the hospital. One of the rooms was the bathroom, so he could take a bath every day. In a short time, his skin got a lot better, and that horrible smell was no longer there. The second room had a bed, table, and chairs. I visited him every day and talked to him. He loved to read and talk about books. At first, he didn't know many books. The Bible and a newspaper or 2, that's all. Later, I gave him some love stories, and he loved them. He read them over and over, and spoke of them often. He knew a new world. He was very happy. But sometimes there were situations that upset Merrick. One day, a new nurse came to the hospital. No one told her about Merrick. She took Merrick's food to his room that day. She opened the door and saw him. She screamed, dropped the food, and ran out of the room. I got a little angry with the nurse and went to see Merrick. He looked upset, but not angry.
People don't like to look at me. I know this, Dr. Trevis,
He said.
They usually laugh or scream.
I don't want the nurses laughing at you, Joseph, I said angrily. I want them to help you.
Thank you, Doctor,
he said in his strange, slow voice.
but it does not matter. Everyone is laughing at me. I understand her.
I looked at him sadly. He held a small photo of his mother in his beautiful left hand. After staring at the picture for a minute or so, he placed it on the table next to a flower. A tear fell from his eye and trickled down the skin of his huge, ugly face.
"Dr. Travis," he said slowly, "you and the nurses are very kind, and I am very happy here. Thanks a lot. But I know I can't stay here long, and I want to live in a lighthouse after the hospital. A lighthouse or a house for the visually impaired. I think these are the best places for me."
"What do you mean?" I asked. "Why?" He didn't look at me. He put the flower on the photo and looked carefully.
"Lighthouses have sea all around them, right?" he said. "No one can look at me in a lighthouse, so I'll be happy there. Blind people can't see anything, so they can't see me either, can they?"
"But, Joseph," I said, "this is your house. You live here now. You will not leave the hospital."
"Maybe not today," he said, "but soon. You are a kind man, Dr. Travis, but I can't stay here long. I have no money."
I smiled. "Joseph," I said, "this is your house now. Don't you understand? You can stay here for the rest of your life." Very carefully, I told him about the money and the letter we wrote to the Times. I don't think he understood the first time, so I told him again. He was quiet for a while. Then he got up and quickly walked up and down the room. He made a strange sound, like a laugh. I didn't want Merrick to live alone, like a man in a lighthouse. He was reading his books and talking to me, but I wanted him to talk to more people. And I wanted him to talk to women, too. Merrick read about women in his books, but he didn't talk much to women. He saw nurses every day, but didn't talk to them much. To them, he was always a creature, not a human being. One day, one of my friends, a young and beautiful woman, came to the hospital. I told her about Merrick and took her to his room. She opened the door and smiled at him. "Good morning, Mr. Merrick," she said. Then she shook his hand. Merrick stared at her for a minute with his mouth open. Then he sat on his bed with his head in his hands and cried. He cried for about 5 minutes. Tears streamed down his face, streaming down through his fingers. My friend sat next to the bed and put her hand on his arm. She smiled but didn't say anything. She shook his hand again before leaving.
"Dr. Travis," he told me that night, "this woman is amazing. My mother smiled at me once many years ago, but no woman smiles at me now. However, this woman smiled at me and shook my hand. A beautiful woman smiled at me and shook my hand."
My young lady friend came back the following week and talked to Merrick for half an hour. She came back with a friend a week later. They gave him some books and had a cup of tea with him. This was a great thing for him. For the first time in his life, he had a few friends. He was sitting in his room, reading his books, and no longer talking about living in a lighthouse. Meanwhile, people started to read about Merrick in the papers, so he had a lot of visitors. Everyone wanted to see him. Many important ladies and gentlemen visited him. They smiled at him, shook his hand, and gave him books. Merrick loved talking to these people, and he was starting to forget about his ugly body. His visitors never laughed at him. He began to feel like a human, not a creature. The Elephant Man, Chapter 5. One day, a very important woman came to the hospital to visit him. I took this lady to his room. Then I opened the door and smiled at him. "Good morning, Joseph," I said. "We have a new visitor for you today. She is a very famous woman." Merrick stood up beside his desk. He wasn't smiling because he couldn't smile, but his eyes looked happy.
"Okay, then,"
he said.
"Who is she?"
I moved away from the door. The visitor walked in. "Your Majesty, this is Joseph Merrick," I said. "Joseph, this is Her Majesty, Queen Alexandra, Queen of England." Queen Alexandra smiled at him. "How are you, Mr. Merrick?" she said. "Nice to meet you." Then she shook his hand. Merrick did not move. He paused for half a minute and stared at her with his mouth open. Then he spoke in a strange, slow voice. How are you, Your Highness?" he said. But I don't think the Queen understood him because he tried to get down on his knees at the same time. It was very difficult for him because of his huge legs. "No, please, Mr. Merrick, get up," said the Queen. "I want to talk with you. Can we sit at your table?" Yes, of course," he said. They sat at the table. The Queen took his beautiful left hand into her own. She looked at the hand carefully, then smiled at Merrick again. "I often read about you in the newspapers," she said. "You are a very interesting man, Mr. Merrick. You have a very difficult life, but people say you are happy. Is this true? Are you happy?" "Oh, yes, Your Highness, yes," said Merrick. "I am a very happy man. Now I have a home, friends, and books here. I am happy every hour of the day." "What a great story," she said. "I'm so glad to hear that. Now, tell me about your books. I see there are a lot of books here." "Yes, Your Majesty, I love my books," said Merrick. And they sat and talked about books for about half an hour. Before the Queen left, she gave him a small book and some red flowers. After the Queen's visit, Merrick tried to sing, but it wasn't easy because of his mouth. Still, there was a strange, happy voice in his room all day. He carefully looked at the flowers and put them on his table. The Queen visited him many times, and at Christmas sent him a Christmas card. "Dear Joseph, I'm sending you a little Christmas present. I guess this picture looks like me, doesn't it? I really enjoy visiting you, and I hope to visit you at the hospital next year as well. Merry Christmas. Your friend, Alexandra." The gift was a picture of Queen Alexandra with her name on it. Merrick wept silently and carefully laid the picture beside the bed in his room. Then he sat down and wrote a letter to the Queen. It was the first letter of his life.
My dear Queen, thank you so much for your wonderful card and beautiful photo. It's the best thing in my room, the most beautiful thing I have. This is my first Christmas in my life, and my first Christmas present, too. Maybe I had a Christmas with my mom once, but I don't remember. I have a picture of my mother, and she is beautiful, just like you. I am a very happy man now. I know many famous ladies and kind people. I feel they love me. I'm so excited to see you again in the new year. Merry Christmas, my dear friend. With all my love, Joseph Merrick. Merrick had a lot of friends now, but he was more like a boy than a man. He could read and talk to his visitors, but he could not leave the hospital alone. He wanted to go to the theater after Christmas. It was very difficult because I didn't want people in the theater to see him. But a kind lady from the theater, Mrs. Kendall, helped us. We bought tickets for a box in the theater. We went to the theater in a coach with dark windows and entered through a back door. No one saw us. 3 nurses were sitting in front of the box. Merrick and I sat behind them in the dark. Nobody in the theater could see us, but we could see the play. It was a Christmas play for children. Merrick loved the play. It was such a wonderful, exciting story. He laughed most of the time and sometimes tried to sing like the children in the theater. At one point in the play, he got very scared because the villain in the play was angry and he had a knife in his hand. At first, Merrick wanted to leave the theater, but I stopped him. Then he got very angry with his villain in the play. He slammed his hand on the chair and stood up and spoke to the man. But no one heard of him. And when the bad guy went to jail, he was overjoyed. Merrick thought the beautiful young woman in the play was wonderful. He was very happy at the end of the play, because that woman married a good young man. He remembered this play for a long time and talked a lot about the characters in the play. He asked me questions like, "What do you think they did after we left? Where do the young woman and young man live? What are they doing now?" "I don't know," I said. "Maybe they live in the country." Merrick thought about this for a long time. Then he said, "Dr. Travis, can I go to the country, please? I saw the countryside once from the train, but I never went there. I often read in books. Beautiful places, aren't they? I want to see."
The Elephant Man, Chapter 6. Visiting the theater was difficult, but touring the countryside was even more difficult. But again, one of his new friends helped us. She had a small house in the country, and Merrick could stay there all summer. I took Merrick to the country on a train. Then we got on a carriage and rode to the country house. There were many trees near the house, but no one lived nearby. A countryman brought food to the house every day, but no one came near the house. I stayed with him that night. It was very dark and quiet at night. In the morning, hundreds of birds were singing in the trees, and everything outside the house was green. Merrick walked under the big trees, looked at everything happily, and sang his strange song. I came back to London, but Merrick stayed there for 6 weeks. He was extremely happy. He wrote me a letter every week. Mr. Dr. Travis, I had another great day today. It was very hot, so I walked under the trees and sat by a stream. The water in the stream made a beautiful sound, like singing. Did you know that? I listened for 2 hours. A lot of little birds came to me. One had a red front body and a brown back. I gave it some bread, and it sat on my hand. Many birds here are now my friends. I also watched the fish in the stream. They were very exciting as they moved so fast. I put my hand in the water, but I couldn't touch them. I met a big dog yesterday. He barked very loudly, but I was not afraid. I sat silently and looked at him. He came and sniffed my hand. I saw him again today and gave him some bread. It likes me now. I will put some flowers from the country in the envelope. There are hundreds of flowers here. Did you know that? I like the little blue ones the most, but they're all so pretty. I have lots of them in my room. I give them water every morning. I'm very happy here, Doctor, but I want to see you again soon. Warm regards from your friend, Joseph Merrick. He returned to London at the end of the summer. He was so good, and his skin looked so much better. He told a lot about the country, but he was also happy to see his friends and books again. It was a pleasure for me to see him so healthy and happy. 6 months later, one morning in April 1890, I entered his room. He was lying on his back, so at first I thought he was sleeping. I talked to him, but he didn't move. Merrick didn't usually sleep on his back. In fact, he couldn't sleep like that. His head was very heavy, so he usually sat on the bed with his arms around his legs. It was more comfortable for him to sleep like that. But he wanted to sleep on his back like us. He tried to sleep on his back that night, but his heavy head fell off the bed and broke his neck. He died very quickly. I couldn't hold back my tears. I took his hand in my palm and said how wonderful it was to know him. The next day, the director of the London hospital, Mr. Carr Gum, wrote again to the editor of the Times. Dear Sir, 3.5 years ago, I wrote to you about a man named Joseph Merrick. They called this man the Elephant Man because he was born with a very ugly body. Merrick wasn't sick, but he couldn't work and had no money. The Times readers felt sorry for him and raised a large amount of money for Merrick. Thanks to this money, we gave Merrick a home at the London hospital. It was his first good home, and he lived here happily for 3.5 years. The doctors and nurses of the hospital helped him, and many important people visited him. He read a lot of books, went to the theater, and spent 6 weeks in the country in the summer. Thanks to your readers' money, we gave him a happy life. Joseph Merrick died quietly in his bed last night. He was a man with a very ugly body, but he was a kind-hearted, polite person. He had many friends. We loved talking to him. We are all very sad because he passed away. Many people will remember him for a long time. There is some money left, and I will give it to the hospital. Thank you for your help, sir. Yours faithfully, F. C. Carr-Gomm, Chairman of the London Hospital. The End.